prodigal son returns after 15 years. Unexpected arrival at Christmas dinner uncovers hidden family secrets. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. The snow falls gently on a small town, blanketing the quiet streets in an eerie calm. Inside a modest home, the warmth of Christmas lights contrasts sharply with the cold tension that fills the air. After 15 long years, an unexpected knock echoes through the hallways, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. She never imagined this night would come, never thought she'd see the face of her lost son again. As the door creaks open, a man stands on the threshold, weathered by time and burdened by secrets. He's not the same boy who left all those years ago. Life has changed him in ways that words can't fully capture. But as he steps back into the family's life, he brings with him a storm of unresolved pain, buried truths, and a revelation that will shatter everything they thought they knew. What could drive a son to abandon his family for so long? And what unimaginable secrets has he kept hidden all these years? This Christmas, the Harris family will face the most unexpected reunion, where love, guilt, and redemption collide in a way that will leave them, and you, forever changed. The biting December wind howled through the bare trees lining Maple Street in the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut. Christmas lights twinkled defiantly against the encroaching darkness, their cheerful glow a stark contrast to the somber mood inside the Harris family home. Sarah Harris stood at the kitchen counter, her weathered hands methodically peeling apples for her famous pie. The familiar motions brought little comfort as her mind wandered, as it often did this time of year, to thoughts of her youngest son, John. 15 long years had passed since that fateful Christmas Eve when angry words and shattered dreams drove him away. Sarah's eyes misted over as she remembered John's face, flushed with hurt and betrayal, before he stormed out into the night, leaving only silence and regret in his wake. The sudden slam of a car door outside startled Sarah from her reverie. She peered out the frost-rimmed window, expecting to see her eldest son Mark returning from work. Instead, her heart nearly stopped as she caught sight of a lone figure trudging up the snow-covered driveway. Even after all these years, she'd recognize that gait anywhere. John. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She watched, transfixed, as her long-lost son hesitated at the foot of the porch steps. The years had not been kind to him. His once proud shoulders were now hunched against the cold, and even from a distance, she could see the premature gray streaking his dark hair. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, John stood motionless, snowflakes gathering on his threadbare coat. Sarah's maternal instinct screamed at her to fling open the door and embrace her child, but fear rooted her to the spot. What if this was just another cruel trick of her imagination? The sharp rap of knuckles against wood shattered the silence. Sarah's legs moved of their own accord, carrying her swiftly to the front door. Her trembling hand hovered over the doorknob for a heartbeat before she summoned the courage to turn it. The door creaked open, and suddenly, John was there, flesh and blood and so achingly real. His hazel eyes, so like his father's, met hers with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Mom," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Before Sarah could respond, a shadow fell across the threshold. Mark appeared behind her, his expression hardening as he took in the scene before him. Well, Mark said, his tone dripping with barely concealed anger. "Look what the cat dragged in." John flinched at his brother's words, but held his ground. "Hello, Mark," he said quietly. It's been a long time." The tension in the air was palpable, crackling like static electricity. Sarah looked between her two sons, her heart breaking anew at the chasm that had opened between them. "What are you doing here, John?" Mark demanded, stepping protectively in front of their mother. "Come to stir up more trouble?" John shook his head, his eyes pleading. "No, I just wanted to come home, to make things right." Sarah's hand flew to her chest, hope blooming despite her best efforts to temper it. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mark cut her off. "Home?" he scoffed, You gave up any right to call this place home when you walked out on us. On Mom. On Dad when he needed you most. John's face crumpled at the mention of their father. I know I made mistakes, he said, his voice thick with regret. But please, just give me a chance to explain. Explain. Mark's laugh was bitter and sharp. 15 years, John. 15 years without so much as a phone call or a letter. What could you possibly say to explain that away? Sarah finally found her voice. Mark, please, she said softly, placing a hand on her eldest son's arm. It's Christmas. Can't we at least hear him out? Mark's jaw clenched, but he stepped aside, allowing John to enter. As he crossed the threshold, John's eyes darted around the familiar entryway, taking in the faded wallpaper and the family photos that still lined the walls, photos that stopped abruptly 15 years ago, as if time itself had frozen in his absence. Sarah guided her prodigal son into the living room, her heart aching at how lost he looked in his childhood home. John sank into the worn armchair by the fireplace, his father's old chair, and for a moment, Sarah could almost see the ghost of her late husband superimposed over her broken boy. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Sarah perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Mark leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. I'm sorry, John finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know those words aren't enough, but I don't know where else to start. Sarah leaned forward, hope and fear warring in her chest. Oh, Johnny, she breathed. Where have you been all this time? We looked for you, we tried to find you. John's eyes filled with tears. I know, Mom. I saw the missing person reports, the newspaper ads, but I couldn't come back. Not then. Why not? Mark's voice was hard, unforgiving. What was so damn important that you had to abandon your family? John flinched at his brother's tone. It's complicated, he said, running a hand through his graying hair. I made some mistakes. Got mixed up in some things I shouldn't have. I thought I was protecting you all by staying away. Sarah's heart clenched at the pain in her son's voice. Protecting us from what, Johnny? Before John could answer, the shrill ring of the telephone cut through the tension. Mark pushed off from the doorframe with a frustrated growl. I'll get it, he muttered, stalking out of the room. In the momentary silence that followed, Sarah studied her youngest son's face. The years had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, speaking of hardships she could only imagine. What trials had her boy endured in his self-imposed exile? Mark's raised voice drifted in from the kitchen. What do you mean there's a problem with the loan? We signed all the paperwork last week. John's head snapped up, his eyes widening in alarm. Loan? He asked, his voice tight. What loan? Sarah sighed, her shoulders sagging. The bank's threatening to foreclose on the house, she admitted quietly. We've been struggling ever since your father passed, and with the medical bills. She trailed off, not wanting to burden her son with their financial woes. But John was already on his feet, pacing the worn carpet with agitation. No, he muttered. This can't be happening. Not after everything. Sarah watched him, confusion and concern etching deeper lines into her face. Johnny? What is it? What's wrong? John turned to her, his eyes wild with a mix of fear and determination. Mom, there's something I need to tell you about why I really left. But before he could continue, Mark burst back into the room, his face flushed with anger. That was the bank, he spat. They're calling in the loan. We have until the end of the month to come up with the money, or we lose the house. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But that's impossible. It's Christmas Eve. Mark's eyes narrowed as he turned to John. Convenient timing for you to show up, isn't it? Come to watch it all fall apart. John shook his head vehemently. No, Mark, you don't understand. I came back to fix this, to make things right. Fix what? Mark demanded. How could you possibly fix 15 years of absence? John took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Because I know why Dad's business failed," he said quietly. "I know about the debt and the man he owed money to, and I know how to make it all go away." The clock in the corner chimed midnight, heralding the arrival of Christmas Day. But for the Harris family, gathered in their living room with secrets hanging heavy in the air, it felt less like a time for celebration and more like the calm before a storm. A storm that threatened to sweep away everything they thought they knew about each other, and about the past that had shaped them all. The grandfather clock's chimes faded into a deafening silence. Sarah's eyes darted between her sons, her heart racing as she tried to process John's words. Mark stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and growing anger. "What are you talking about?" Mark finally growled, taking a menacing step towards his brother. "What do you know about Dad's business?" John held up his hands placatingly. "It's a long story, Mark. One I should have told years ago." Sarah rose shakily from the sofa. "I think," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we all need to sit down and talk about this. But first, let's have some dinner. I've got a pot roast in the oven that should be just about done." The tension in the room was palpable as the family made their way to the dining room. The table, set for two, now seemed woefully inadequate. Sarah busied herself adding an extra place setting for John, her hands shaking as she laid out the good china they reserved for special occasions. As they settled into their seats, the aroma of Sarah's cooking filled the air. Under normal circumstances, it would have been mouth-watering. Tonight, it seemed to turn everyone's stomach. Sarah served the meal in tense silence. John picked at his food, stealing glances at his mother and brother. Mark stabbed at his pot roast with barely contained fury, while Sarah pushed her peas around her plate, her appetite gone. Finally, Mark slammed his fork down. "Enough of this," he snapped. "Start talking, John. What do you know about Dad's business?" John took a deep breath, setting down his own utensils. "Do you remember Mr. Donovan?" he asked quietly. Sarah's face paled at the name. "Your father's old business partner?" John nodded grimly. "He wasn't just a partner, Mom. He was a loan shark. Dad borrowed money from him when the business started struggling." Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's impossible. Dad would never dash." "He did." John cut him off. "I found out by accident. Overheard a phone call. Dad was in deep way over his head, and Donovan was threatening to come after us if he didn't pay up." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Is that why you left?" John's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I could fix it. I went to Donovan, tried to make a deal. But things went wrong." The room seemed to spin around Sarah as memories came flooding back. The hushed arguments between her husband and John in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. The haunted look in her son's eyes that last Christmas Eve. "What kind of deal, John?" Mark demanded, his voice low and dangerous. John ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping. "I offered to work off Dad's debt. Donovan agreed, but the terms, they were brutal. I couldn't tell you, couldn't risk you trying to stop me or getting involved." Sarah reached out, grasping John's hand. "Oh, my boy," she whispered. "What did you do?" Before John could answer, a sharp knock at the front door made them all jump. Mark rose, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Who could that be at this hour? Sarah wondered aloud, her voice tinged with worry. John's face had gone ashen. "No," he muttered. "No, it can't be. He promised me more time." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Who promised you more time, John? What have you gotten us into?" Another knock, more insistent this time. Mark strode towards the front door, ignoring John's frantic protests. "Mark, don't dash," John began, but it was too late. The door swung open, revealing a tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the snowy night. The man stepped into the light, a cold smile playing on his lips. Well, he drawled. "Quite the family reunion you've got going on here, Johnny boy." Sarah gasped, recognizing the man instantly. "Mr. Donovan?" Donovan's gaze swept over the room, settling on John with predatory intensity. Did you really think you could come back here without consequences? He asked, his voice deceptively soft. You know the terms of our agreement, John. It's time to pay up. Mark whirled on his brother, his face contorted with rage and confusion. What the hell is going on, John? What agreement? John stood slowly, placing himself between his family and Donovan. I'll go with you, he said quietly. Just give me a moment with my family. Donovan chuckled, the sound sending chills down Sarah's spine. Oh, I'm afraid it's not that simple anymore, John. You see, your little disappearing act cost me a lot of money. And now, well, I think it's time for your family to learn exactly what kind of man you really are. Sarah watched in horror as Donovan reached into his coat, producing a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the dining room table, where it landed with a dull thud among the half-eaten dinner. Go ahead, Donovan sneered. Open it. I think you'll find the contents quite illuminating. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the envelope. As she began to open it, she caught John's eye. The look of absolute despair on her son's face made her blood run cold. Mom, please, John whispered. You don't have to dash. But it was too late. The contents of the envelope spilled out across the table, a cascade of photographs and documents that would forever change the Harris family's understanding of the past 15 years. As Sarah's eyes fell on the first photograph, a strangled cry escaped her lips. The pot roast grew cold, forgotten, as the true cost of John's sacrifice began to reveal itself in brutal, undeniable detail. Christmas carols drifted faintly from a neighbor's house, the cheerful melodies a stark counterpoint to the unfolding tragedy within the Harris home. The dinner that was meant to reunite a broken family had instead become the catalyst for revelations that threatened to tear them apart forever. And as the clock ticked relentlessly towards midnight, the full weight of John's words from earlier hung in the air like a portent of doom. I came back to fix this, to make things right. But as the awful truth lay exposed on the dining room table, one question burned in the minds of everyone present. Was it already too late? The harsh glare of streetlights cut through the swirling snow as John stumbled away from his childhood home. The warmth of the Harris house faded quickly, replaced by the biting cold of a New England winter night. But the chill in John's bones had little to do with the weather. His mind reeled, replaying the shocked expressions on his family's faces as Donovan's photos spilled across the dinner table. The sickening realization in his mother's eyes, the fury and disgust twisting Mark's features. It was everything John had feared for 15 long years. As he trudged through the deserted streets of Millbrook, memories assaulted him with every familiar landmark. The elementary school where he and Mark had played countless games of kickball. The ice cream parlor where Dad would take them after Little League games. The old oak tree in the town square where he'd carved Sarah Miller's initials next to his own. Certain she was his first true love. John paused, leaning against the rough bark of that same oak. How naive he'd been back then. How innocent. Before he knew about loan sharks and impossible debts. Before he'd learned just how far a desperate man would go to protect his family. A gust of wind cut through his thin jacket, and John shivered. He should find somewhere warm to wait out the night. But his feet carried him forward, drawn by an invisible thread to the places that had shaped his youth. The Harris brothers had been inseparable once. John could almost hear the echo of their laughter as he passed the vacant lot where they'd built rickety forts and fought imaginary monsters. He remembered the fierce pride in Mark's eyes when John hit his first home run, and the gentle way his big brother had bandaged his skinned knees after particularly rough games. When had that bond begun to fray? John's steps slowed as he approached Millbrook High School. The building loomed dark and silent, but in his mind's eye, he saw it bustling with activity. He and Mark walking the halls, Mark the popular athlete, John the quiet bookworm, but always together, always watching each other's backs. Until senior year, until the accident. John's breath caught in his throat as the memories crashed over him. The screeching tires, the sickening crunch of metal, Dad's broken body in the hospital bed. It should have been you behind the wheel, Mark had snarled in a moment of grief-stricken rage. You're the responsible one. You should have been driving him home." The words had cut deeper than any knife. And in that moment, something fundamental had shifted between the Harris brothers. The easy camaraderie of youth gave way to resentment, to unspoken blame. John hadn't known then about the mounting medical bills, about the desperate measures their father had taken to keep the family afloat. He'd been too caught up in his own guilt, his own pain. A choked sob escaped John's lips, misting in the frigid air. He'd been so blind, so selfish. He'd thought leaving would protect them all. Instead, he'd only compounded the tragedy, abandoning his family when they needed him most. Lost in his thoughts, John barely registered the sound of approaching footsteps until a familiar voice cut through the night. "John? John Harris? Is that really you?" He turned, squinting against the swirling snow. A figure emerged from the gloom, and John's heart clenched as recognition dawned. "Tommy?" he whispered. "Tommy Blake." His childhood best friend stood before him, older now with streaks of gray in his dark hair. But his eyes were the same, kind, curious, and currently wide with shock. "My God, it is you," Tommy breathed. "We all thought. Hell, John, where have you been?" The simple question hit John like a physical blow. Where had he been? In the darkest places a man could go, doing things he'd never be able to fully explain or atone for. It's a long story, Tommy," John managed, his voice rough with emotion. Tommy studied him for a long moment, taking in John's haggard appearance and haunted eyes. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and enveloped his long-lost friend in a fierce embrace. John stiffened at first, unused to such open affection after so many years of isolation. But as Tommy's warmth seeped into him, something inside John cracked. He sagged against his friend, 15 years of pent-up grief and loneliness pouring out in heaving sobs. "It's okay, buddy," Tommy murmured, holding John tight. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. You're home now." Home. The word echoed in John's mind, a bittersweet reminder of all he'd lost, of the family he'd left behind, now irrevocably changed by the revelations of the night. As his sobs subsided, John pulled back, wiping roughly at his eyes. "Tommy, I've done terrible things. Things I can never take back." Tommy's grip on John's shoulders tightened. "We've all got regrets, John, but you were always the best of us. Whatever happened, I know you must have had your reasons." John shook his head, a mirthless laugh escaping him. "You don't know what I've become, Tommy. If you did, then tell me," Tommy said firmly. "Tell me everything." For a moment, John was tempted to unburden himself, to share the weight he'd carried alone for so long. But the memory of Donovan's cold smile flashed through his mind, and he knew he couldn't risk involving anyone else. "I can't," John whispered. "It's not safe, for you or for anyone who knows the truth." Tommy's brow furrowed with concern. "John, are you in some kind of trouble? Do you need help?" Before John could respond, a car turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. John instinctively shrank back, his heart racing. "I have to go," he said urgently. "Tommy, please, forget you saw me tonight. It's better for everyone that way." "John, wait," Tommy called. But John was already moving, melting into the shadows between buildings. As he ran, the ache in John's chest threatened to overwhelm him. He'd come back to Millbrook hoping to make amends, to set things right. Instead, he'd only stirred up old wounds and created new ones. The photo of his mother's stricken face flashed before his eyes, Mark's look of utter betrayal. And now Tommy, the concern in his old friend's eyes a painful reminder of the bonds John had severed. He'd been a fool to think he could ever truly come home. The past couldn't be erased, and the secrets he carried were a cancer, poisoning everything they touched. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, John Harris made a decision. He would face Donovan one last time, settle their accounts once and for all, and then, for the sake of everyone he loved, he would disappear again. This time, forever. The Harris family home stood silent in the pale light of Christmas morning, a deceptive calm masking the turmoil within. Sarah sat motionless at the dining room table. The remnants of last night's disastrous dinner still spread before her. Her eyes, red-rimmed from a sleepless night of tears, fixed on the scattered photos and documents that had shattered her world. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs broke her reverie. Mark appeared in the doorway, his face haggard and drawn. He paused, taking in the scene his mother, small and fragile in her faded robe, surrounded by the evidence of John's secret life. "Mom," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "You should try to get some sleep." Sarah shook her head, not looking up. "How can I sleep, Mark? How can I close my eyes when all I see is... Her voice broke, fresh tears threatening to fall. Mark's jaw clenched as he crossed the room, gathering the damning photos into a messy pile. "We'll figure this out, Mom. We'll dash." "Don't." Sarah's hand shot out, stopping him. "Please, just don't touch them." For a moment, mother and son stared at each other across the table, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between them. Finally, Mark sank into a chair, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I should have known," he muttered. "All these years, I should have realized something wasn't right." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated, guilt etching deep lines around his mouth. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've kept secret for far too long." Sarah's heart clenched, dreading what new revelation might be coming. "Mark." He took a deep breath, unable to meet her eyes. "The night John left, I knew why. At least I thought I did." The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow to Sarah's already fragile composure. "You knew? All this time?" Mark nodded miserably. "I overheard Dad and John arguing. About money, about some deal gone wrong. I thought, God, I was so stupid. I thought John had gotten mixed up in something illegal, that he was running to save his own skin." Sarah's mind reeled, trying to reconcile this new information with the devastating revelations of the night before. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was angry." Mark's fist came down on the table, making the china rattle. "I was furious that he'd abandon you when things got tough, and I was ashamed." "Ashamed?" Sarah echoed, confusion clear in her voice. Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "All those years, you and Dad pushed me to be more like John. Responsible John. Smart John. I was always second best, always in his shadow. And then, when he left, part of me was glad." The admission hung in the air, stark and painful. Sarah reached out, her hand trembling as she covered Mark's clenched fist. "Oh, Mark," she whispered. "I had no idea you felt that way." "Neither did I, not really," Mark said quietly. "Not until he was gone. And then I was too proud, too angry to admit I might have been wrong about him." Sarah's mind whirled, piecing together the fragments of the past. The growing distance between her sons in those final months before John's disappearance. The way Mark had thrown himself into work after John left, taking on the role of family protector with grim determination. "All this time," she murmured, "we've all been keeping secrets, haven't we?" Before Mark could respond, a sharp knock at the front door made them both jump. They exchanged a wary glance, the memory of Donovan's unexpected arrival still fresh. Mark rose, moving cautiously towards the entryway. Sarah's heart pounded as she heard the door open, straining to catch any hint of who might be there. "John!" Mark's voice, a mixture of surprise and lingering anger, carried clearly through the house. Sarah was on her feet in an instant, hurrying to the door. And there, framed in the soft light of Christmas morning, stood her prodigal son. John looked even more haggard than he had the night before, dark circles under his eyes speaking of a sleepless night. But there was a new resolve in his stance, a determination that sent a shiver of apprehension down Sarah's spine. "I can't stay long," John said, his voice rough, "but I owed you both an explanation. The full truth this time." Mark's expression hardened. "I think we saw plenty of truth last night, John." John flinched at the words, but held his ground. "You saw what Donovan wanted you to see." But there's more to the story. So much more. For a long moment, the three Harris family members stood frozen in tableau, John on the threshold, Mark blocking his path, Sarah caught between them. Then, slowly, Mark stepped aside. "You've got 10 minutes, he growled. "And then I want you gone." John nodded, relief and fear warring in his eyes as he stepped into his childhood home. As the door closed behind him, shutting out the peaceful Christmas morning, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were sealing their fate. Whatever John had come to tell them, she knew with bone-deep certainty that their lives would never be the same after this conversation. For better or for worse, the time for secrets was over. With a deep breath, Sarah squared her shoulders and followed her sons into the living room. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, counting down the moments until the final truths would be revealed. 10 minutes to unravel 15 years of lies and misunderstandings. 10 minutes to heal a lifetime of hurt, or to sever the last fragile threads holding their family together. As John sank into their father's old armchair, his face a mask of grim determination, Sarah sent up a silent prayer. "Let there be forgiveness," she pleaded. "Let there be understanding. Let there somehow still be love." The living room of the Harris home, once a sanctuary of warmth and family memories, now felt more like a courtroom. John sat rigid in his father's armchair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to hide their trembling. Mark leaned against the fireplace, arms crossed, his stance radiating hostility. Sarah perched on the edge of the sofa, her eyes darting anxiously between her sons. "Start talking," Mark growled, breaking the tense silence. "And make it good." John took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere between his mother and brother. "It all started the night of Dad's accident," he began, his voice low and strained. "I overheard him on the phone with Donovan. He was begging for more time, saying he'd do anything to protect his family." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. "Your father never said a word." "He didn't want to worry you," John said softly. "But I knew something was terribly wrong, so I did some digging. That's when I found out about the loan, about how deep in debt Dad really was." Mark's jaw clenched. "And you didn't think to tell anyone? To ask for help?" John's eyes flashed with a mixture of pain and defiance. "Who could I have told, Mark? Mom was already stretched thin caring for Dad. You were barely keeping it together yourself. And if word got out about the debt, it would have ruined what was left of the business. So you took it upon yourself to fix everything," Mark scoffed. Typical John, always the hero. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," John shot back, a hint of his old fire returning. "I was trying to save our family from ruin, from worse than ruin." Sarah leaned forward, her voice trembling. "What do you mean, Johnny? What could be worse than ruin?" John's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. "Donovan wasn't just a loan shark, Mom. He is involved in things far darker than money lending. If Dad couldn't pay, Donovan made it clear he'd come after all of us." The implications of John's words hung heavy in the air. Sarah felt her world tilting on its axis, everything she thought she knew about her life, her husband, crumbling around her. "So you made a deal," Mark said, his voice flat. "You sold your soul to the devil to save us." John nodded, unable to meet his brother's accusing gaze. "I offered to work off Dad's debt." Donovan agreed, but the terms, God, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. With shaking hands, John reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope. "These are the real documents, the ones Donovan didn't want you to see last night. They show everything, the original loan, the threats, the things I've done to keep you all safe." He held out the envelope, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it. As she began to read, her face paled, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, Johnny," she whispered, "what have you done?" Mark snatched the papers from his mother's hands, his eyes scanning the damning evidence. With each page, the anger in his expression gave way to horror, then to a dawning understanding. "All this time," Mark said, his voice hoarse, "all these years you were protecting you, John finished. The only way I knew how. The clock on the mantel chimed, startling them all. John glanced at it, his face tightening. I don't have much time. Donovan's men will be looking for me. I needed you to know the truth. To understand why I left. Why I stayed away. Sarah rose, crossing the room to kneel before her youngest son. She took his hands in hers, her touch as gentle as it had been when he was a child with scraped knees and hurt feelings. John, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Why didn't you come to us? We could have faced this together. John shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. I couldn't risk it. Donovan made it clear what would happen if I involved any of you. And after a while, after the things I'd done, I was ashamed. I didn't think I deserved to come home. Mark set the papers down, running a hand over his face. When he spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. You idiot, he said, but there was no heat in the words. You goddamn self-sacrificing idiot. John looked up at his brother, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Mark! In 2 quick strides, Mark crossed the room and pulled John to his feet, enveloping him in a fierce embrace. You should have told me, he muttered into John's shoulder. We could have figured something out, together. As the Harris brothers clung to each other, years of misunderstanding and resentment crumbling in the face of the terrible truth, Sarah felt her heart both breaking and mending. Her boys, her precious boys, reunited at last. But the moment of reconciliation was shattered by the sudden screech of tires outside. John wrenched himself from Mark's arms, his face a mask of fear. They're here, he said urgently. Donovan's men. I've stayed too long. Sarah clutched at John's arm. No, you can't go. We'll call the police, we'll dash. John shook his head, cutting her off. It's too late for that, Mom. If I don't go with them, they'll hurt you. Both of you. Mark's expression hardened with resolve. Then we'll all go. Face this together like we should have from the start. For a moment, John looked torn between hope and despair. Then slowly he nodded. Okay, he whispered. Okay, together. As the sound of heavy footsteps approached the front door, the Harris family stood united for the first time in 15 years. Sarah reached out, taking one of John's hands and one of Mark's in her own. Whatever happens, she said firmly, we face it as a family. No more secrets. No more running. The door burst open, flooding the room with harsh winter light. As Donovan's men entered, weapons drawn, the Harris family stood their ground, united in love, in truth, and in the unshakable bond of family that had endured despite years of separation and misunderstanding. In that moment, facing an uncertain and dangerous future, they were stronger together than they had ever been apart. And for John, finally home after so long in the darkness, that knowledge was worth any price he might have to pay. The Harris living room, once a haven of familial warmth, now felt more like a war zone. Donovan's men, 3 hulking figures dressed in dark suits, filled the doorway. Their expressionless faces and the telltale bulges beneath their jackets spoke volumes about their intentions. John instinctively stepped in front of his mother and brother, his body tense as a coiled spring. This is between you and me, he said, his voice low and steady. Leave my family out of it. The tallest of the men, a scarred brute with cold blue eyes, sneered. Boss wants to see all of you. Now. Sarah's grip on her son's hands tightened. We're not going anywhere, she declared, her voice trembling but determined. Mark nodded, his jaw set. That's right. Whatever this is about, we face it together. A flicker of admiration crossed John's face, quickly replaced by fear. He knew all too well what Donovan was capable of. Please, he implored his family. You don't understand what you're getting into. Before anyone could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Oh, I think they understand perfectly well, Johnny boy. Donovan himself appeared in the doorway, shouldering past his men. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, looking more like a Wall Street executive than a criminal mastermind. but the predatory gleam in his eyes betrayed his true nature. "Well, isn't this touching?" Donovan drawled, his gaze sweeping over the united Harris family. "The prodigal son returns, and all is forgiven. If only real life were so simple." John's fists clenched at his sides. "I've done everything you asked, Donovan. I've more than paid off my father's debt. Let my family go." Donovan chuckled, the sound devoid of any real humor. "Oh, John, you still don't get it, do you? This was never about the money. It was about power, control. And now, well," he spread his hands, grinning, "now I have the whole set." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes flashing with maternal fury. "You listen to me, Mr. Donovan. I don't care who you are or what you think you're entitled to. You will not threaten my family." For a moment, genuine surprise flickered across Donovan's face. Then he laughed, a full-bodied sound that sent chills down everyone's spine. "Oh, I like her, John. I can see where you get your spirit from." His expression hardened. "But spirit isn't enough, I'm afraid. Not nearly enough." With a quick gesture, Donovan signaled to his men. They moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing Mark and Sarah before anyone could react. "No!" John lunged forward, only to be caught by Donovan himself, the older man's strength belying his polished appearance. "Here's how this is going to work," Donovan said calmly, as if discussing a business transaction. "You're going to come with us, John, all of you, and we're going to have a nice, long chat about your future with my organization." Mark struggled against his captor's grip. "Like hell we are." Donovan's smile was cold. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice. Unless, of course, John would like to make one last noble sacrifice." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to John. He stood frozen, the weight of 15 years of guilt and sacrifice etched in every line of his face. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Donovan released his hold on John, straightening his suit jacket. "It's simple, really. You come with us, alone, and recommit to our arrangement. In return, your family goes free. No repercussions, no looking over their shoulders for the rest of their lives." "John, no," Sarah cried, struggling against her captor. "We won't let you do this." But John wasn't looking at his mother. His eyes were locked on Mark's, a lifetime of unspoken understanding passing between the brothers in that moment. "If I do this," John said slowly, "you swear they'll be safe? You'll leave them alone?" Donovan placed a hand over his heart in mock sincerity. "You have my word as a gentleman and a businessman." Mark's face contorted with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Don't you dare, John. We said we'd face this together." John turned to his family, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I love you both so much, but this is the only way to make things right." Before anyone could stop him, John stepped towards Donovan. "I'll go with you. Just let me say goodbye." Donovan considered for a moment, then nodded. At his signal, his men released Sarah and Mark. John embraced his mother first, holding her tightly as she sobbed against his chest. "I'm so proud of you, Johnny," she whispered. "So proud. And so sorry." "Don't be sorry, Mom," John murmured. "You gave me the strength to do what's right. I'll never forget that." He turned to Mark next, the brother's eyes shining with unshed tears. "Take care of Mom," John said, his voice rough with emotion. "And Mark, I'm sorry for everything." Mark gripped his brother's shoulders, shaking his head. "No, I'm sorry. I should have known, should have trusted you. We'll find a way to fix this, John. I promise." John managed a weak smile. "I know you will. You always were the stubborn one." With a final, lingering look at his family, John turned to Donovan. "I'm ready." As Donovan's men escorted John from the house, Sarah and Mark clung to each other, watching helplessly as their loved one was taken away once more. But this time, there was no anger, no misunderstanding clouding their hearts. Only love, and a fierce determination to bring John home for good. The door closed behind them with a final, ominous click. In the sudden silence, The Harris family Christmas tree twinkled innocently, its lights a stark reminder of the joy and peace that had been so brutally shattered. Sarah wiped her eyes, straightening her shoulders with newfound resolve. "Mark," she said, her voice steady. "Call the police. It's time we fought back." As Mark reached for the phone, a flicker of hope ignited in both their hearts. They had lost John once to secrets and sacrifice. They would not lose him again. The battle for their family's future had only just begun. 1 year later, the soft glow of Christmas lights illuminated the Harris family living room, casting a warm radiance over the gathered faces. Sarah stood by the fireplace, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged a plate of her famous gingerbread cookies. Mark sat on the couch, his posture tense despite his attempts to appear relaxed. The air was thick with anticipation and a nervous energy that belied the festive decorations. A knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah's eyes met Mark's, a mixture of hope and apprehension reflected in both their gazes. "I'll get it," Mark said softly, rising from the couch. As he opened the door, a gust of cold air swept in, along with a familiar figure that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. John stood on the threshold, looking older and more weathered than when they'd last seen him, but undeniably alive and free. His eyes, once haunted by secrets and guilt, now shone with a cautious hope. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice rough with emotion. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Sarah rushed forward, enveloping her youngest son in a fierce embrace. Mark joined them, his strong arms encircling both his mother and brother. "You're home," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're finally home." As they separated, John looked around the room, taking in the familiar sights and smells of Christmas at the Harris house. His gaze lingered on the empty chair by the fireplace, his father's old seat. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see this place again," he admitted quietly. Mark squeezed his shoulder. "We never gave up hope, not for a second." Sarah ushered them into the living room, fussing over John in a way that brought a small smile to his tired face. As they settled into their seats, the weight of the past year hung heavy in the air. "I can't believe it's really over," John said, shaking his head in wonder. "When the FBI stormed Donovan's compound, I thought for sure that was the end." Mark leaned forward, his expression serious. "You took an enormous risk wearing that wire. If they had discovered it..." John's smile was grim. "It was worth it. To bring Donovan down, to keep you all safe. I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Sarah reached out, taking one of John's hands in hers. "No more sacrifices," she said firmly. "We're a family. We face things together from now on." A comfortable silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sound of carolers on the street outside. "So," John said eventually, his tone lighter, "what did I miss? Catch me up on everything." As Mark launched into a recounting of the year's events, his promotion at work, Sarah's newfound passion for community theater, the neighborhood gossip, John felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire or his mother's infamous eggnog. This was what he had fought for, what he had sacrificed everything to protect. The simple joy of being with family, of shared laughter and inside jokes, of belonging. As the evening wore on, the initial awkwardness faded, replaced by a tentative but growing sense of normalcy. They exchanged gifts, simple things, but each one imbued with the love and gratitude of a family reunited against all odds. When the grandfather clock chimed midnight, heralding the arrival of Christmas Day, Sarah raised her glass in a toast. "To family," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "To second chances, and to new beginnings." "To family," John and Mark echoed, their glasses clinking together. As they sipped their drinks, John's gaze fell on the Christmas tree, its lights twinkling merrily. Nestled among the branches was an ornament he remembered from his childhood. A small, handmade star, slightly lopsided but lovingly crafted. He had made it in first grade, proudly presenting it to his parents as the perfect tree topper. "You kept it," he murmured, nodding towards the star. Sarah followed his gaze, her eyes softening. Of course we did, honey. Every Christmas, it reminded us that you were out there somewhere. That someday you'd find your way back to us. John swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. I'm sorry it took so long, he said quietly. I'm sorry for all the pain I caused. Mark set down his glass, fixing John with a steady gaze. We've all made mistakes, brother. What matters is that we're here now together. Sarah nodded in agreement. The past is the past. What's important is the future we build from here. As if on cue, a light snow began to fall outside, dusting the world in a blanket of white. John stood, moving to the window to watch the gentle flurries. You know, he said, a hint of his old mischief creeping into his voice. I seem to remember a Harris family tradition of midnight sledding on Christmas Eve. Mark's eyebrows shot up. You can't be serious. We haven't done that since we were kids. But Sarah was already on her feet, a youthful spark in her eyes. Why not? It's never too late to revive a good tradition. As they bundled up in coats and scarves, laughing like children at the absurdity of their midnight adventure, John felt the last of his burdens lifting. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still wounds to heal, trusts to rebuild. But here, in this moment, with the promise of a snowy hillside and the warmth of his family surrounding him, John Harris knew he was exactly where he belonged. Together, they stepped out into the snowy night, ready to create new memories and strengthen the bonds that had endured through years of separation and hardship. As their laughter echoed through the quiet streets of Millbrook, it carried with it the joy of a family made whole again, and the hope of all the Christmases yet to come. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the snow-covered streets of Millbrook in soft hues of pink and gold, the Harris family trudged home from their impromptu sledding adventure. Their cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion, but their eyes sparkled with a joy that had been absent for far too long. John lagged slightly behind Sarah and Mark, watching his mother and brother with a mixture of love and lingering disbelief. After 15 years of darkness and sacrifice, the simple act of sharing laughter and creating new memories felt almost surreal. As they entered the warmth of the house, shaking snow from their boots and unwinding scarves, Sarah turned to her sons with a gentle smile. Why don't you boys get cleaned up? I'll make us some hot chocolate, the way your father used to. The mention of their father sent a momentary pang through the room, but it was softer now, tinged with fondness rather than raw grief. John and Mark exchanged a glance, years of unspoken understanding passing between them. Sounds perfect, Mom, Mark said, giving her a quick hug before heading upstairs. John hesitated, his hand on the banister. Actually, if it's okay, I'd like to help you in the kitchen. Sarah's eyes misted over, and she nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. As they worked side by side, John stirring the cocoa while Sarah gathered mugs, the familiar rhythm of domesticity began to heal wounds that words alone could not touch. I missed this, John said softly, inhaling the rich scent of chocolate and cinnamon. More than I even realized. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. We missed you too, sweetheart. Every single day. John set down the spoon, turning to face his mother fully. Mom, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said earlier. Sarah's brow furrowed with concern, but she waited patiently for John to continue. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. The doctors at the FBI debriefing. They found something. During the medical exams. Sarah's grip on John's arm tightened involuntarily. What is it, Johnny? What's wrong? John managed a weak smile, trying to soften the blow. It's my heart. The stress of the past 15 years, the conditions I was living in. It's taken a toll. They're not sure how much time I have left. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sarah absorbed the devastating news. For a moment, she was transported back to that terrible night when they'd lost John's father. The same mix of disbelief, anger, and crushing fear threatening to overwhelm her. But then she looked into her son's eyes that had seen too much, endured too much, yet still held a spark of the boy she'd raised, and found her resolve. How long? she asked, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. John shook his head. They're not sure. Could be years. Could be... He trailed off, unable to voice the worst-case scenario. Sarah pulled him into a fierce embrace, as if she could shield him from this new threat through sheer force of will. "Listen to me, John Harris," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "You fought your way back to us against impossible odds. We are not losing you now. Do you understand me?" John's arms tightened around his mother, drawing strength from her unwavering faith. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. They stood like that for a long moment, the cocoa forgotten on the stove. When they finally separated, both had tears in their eyes, but there was a new determination in their faces. "We should tell Mark," John said, running a hand through his hair. Sarah nodded, squaring her shoulders. "We will, but not tonight. Tonight is for healing, for being together. We'll face this new challenge tomorrow, as a family." As if on cue, Mark's voice floated down from upstairs. "Hey, is that hot chocolate ready? I'm freezing up here." John and Sarah shared a look, years of keeping secrets making them experts at masking their emotions. With practiced ease, they wiped away their tears and plastered on smiles. "Coming right up," Sarah called back, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt. As they carried the steaming mugs into the living room, where Mark waited by the crackling fire, John felt a bittersweet ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his medical condition. This moment, this simple, perfect moment of family togetherness, was everything he had fought for, everything he had dreamed of during his darkest hours. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever time he had left, John vowed to cherish every second, to make up for lost time, to create memories that would sustain his family long after he was gone. As the Harris family settled in for a cozy Christmas morning, sharing stories and laughter over hot chocolate, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows. They illuminated the scene like a painting, a moment of pure joy, frozen in time. And in that moment, surrounded by the love he had sacrificed everything to protect, John Harris was at peace. Epilogue: 1 year later. The cemetery was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the gentle autumn breeze. Sarah and Mark stood side by side before a simple headstone, its polished surface reflecting the warm afternoon sun. Sarah knelt, placing a bouquet of vibrant wildflowers at the base of the stone. Her fingers traced the engraved letters with tender reverence. "John Harris, beloved son and brother, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." "I can't believe it's been a year," Mark said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "In some ways, it feels like yesterday. In others, a lifetime." They stood in comfortable silence, each lost in their own memories of the too brief time they'd had with John after his return. The laughter-filled sledding adventure on that first Christmas Eve. The tearful conversations as they worked through years of misunderstandings and pain. The quiet moments of simply being together, cherishing what they had nearly lost forever. "You know," Mark said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips, "I keep expecting him to show up again, to pull off one last miraculous return." Sarah chuckled softly, linking her arm through her son's. "Your brother always did have a flair for the dramatic." As they turned to leave, Sarah paused, looking back at the headstone. "We're keeping our promise, Johnny," she said, her voice carrying on the breeze. "We're living, we're loving, we're making every moment count." Mark squeezed his mother's hand, adding his own silent vow to his brother's memory. Together, they walked out of the cemetery, their steps lighter than when they had entered. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, a reminder of the beauty that still existed in the world, even in the face of loss. As they reached their car, Sarah looked up at Mark with a determined gleam in her eye. "What do you say we swing by the store and pick up some hot chocolate? I think it's time we revived another Harris family tradition." Mark's eyebrows shot up in surprise, then a slow grin spread across his face. "Midnight sledding? In October?" Sarah shrugged, a mischievous spark in her eyes that was pure John. "Why not? Life's too short to wait for perfect moments. We have to make them ourselves. As they drove away, the last rays of sunlight caught the polished surface of John's headstone, making it gleam like a beacon. And for just a moment, in the fading light, one could almost imagine a third figure walking beside Sarah and Mark, a guardian angel, perhaps watching over the family he had given everything to protect. The Harris family's story was far from over. There would be more challenges, more joys, more moments of both heartbreak and triumph. But they would face it all together, carrying John's memory and his sacrifice in their hearts. For in the end, it was not the years in their life that mattered most, but the life in their years. And John Harris, in his all too brief time with them, had taught them how to truly live. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.